Jesus said to his followers, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if someone strikes you in the right cheek, turn the other cheek also. Turn the other cheek also. And if someone wants to sue you to take your coat, give them also your cloak. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your friends, your neighbors, and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be like children to your Father in heaven. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what have you done that others have not? Do not the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, like your Father in heaven is perfect. This is the word of the Lord.
John, are you sure about that last line? Be perfect as your Father is perfect?
Greg, page 5 in the Pew Bible.
Be perfect as God is perfect. Everyone who is perfect, please stand up. I see some people looking at their spouses with that look that says, don't even think about it. Not only be perfect, but Jesus also says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, let them hit you on the left as well. Love not only your neighbor, but love your enemy. This is one of those texts that is just begging me to skip over it. Its demands are unreasonable. But perhaps if we wrestle with the text, we can squeeze something out of this passage. Now, to grasp what Jesus intends in our text for today, we have to see it in context. In the Gospel of Matthew, 3 full chapters are devoted to this familiar section known as the Sermon on the Mount. The author pulls back from describing episodes in the life of Jesus, arguing with his opponents, healing the ill, performing miracles, and instead focuses in on some of the teachings of Jesus. The sermon begins with the Beatitudes, a series of blessings which run counter to cultural assumptions and, frankly, common logic. Instead of saying, blessed are those who have reason to celebrate, he says, blessed are those who mourn. Instead of blessed are those who are bold, it is blessed are those who are meek. Instead of saying blessed are those who are successful, he says blessed are those who are persecuted for a righteous cause. Jesus undoubtedly seized attention by countering the commonly held assumptions. Today's text falls in that same chapter with the Beatitudes. They are the last two in a string of 6 very provocative teachings. We might want to label these as antithesis teachings that are impossible to fulfill. The basic formula for each of the 6 teachings is this: you have heard it said X, but I say to you Y. The first one is, you have heard it said from ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders is liable to judgment. But I say to you, whoever is angry with another is liable to judgment. All who've been angry at someone, please raise your hand. That's the first of the 6 sayings, and John told us the last 2. Do not seek revenge, turn the other cheek, and love your enemies. Then Jesus ties up all 6 in this nice package by saying, therefore be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. If you want to win people over to your cause, you set the bar as low as possible. You do not set it so high that no one can accomplish it. But Jesus says, not do the best you can. He does not say be all that you can be. He says be perfect. Now, when Jesus referred to this Old Testament law, an eye for an eye, he was pointing to a law that was created to limit vengeance. Harm usually provokes escalating levels of harm. If you strike me with a club, I will stab you with a knife. If you steal one of my sheep, I will steal 10 of yours. Recognition of this human propensity to spiral into more severe acts of retaliation, the law prescribing an eye for an eye sought to limit the violence by commanding that it could only be proportional. It's not acceptable to kill for an eye. You cannot take 2 eyes for an eye. It is an eye for an eye. Now, by the time of Jesus, the rabbis had begun to soften even this. They began to teach that in such situations, you should compensate someone financially rather than physically. That was surely an advancement. It was more humane. However, Jesus counsels us to go much, much further. He challenged people to totally rethink how we respond to evil. And for those gathered at his feet, this was no abstract teaching. It had everyday, real-world application. Jesus was speaking to first-century Jews who were living under the harsh Roman occupation, living under a power that has no respect for your religion and seizes opportunities to humiliate you, if not physically harm you, becomes increasingly difficult to bear. The anger within begins to mount until it begs to explode in violence. Today's news reports similar situations in Middle East countries. Now, you may have heard about the Zealots. The Zealots were a party, a Jewish party that existed during the time of Jesus. And they thought that many of the other Jews were being way too passive about this oppressive regime. They advocated armed rebellion against the Romans, despite the fact that it would have been suicide. Jesus knew that violence always begets greater violence. He wanted his followers to resist the occupiers, but not with the same brutal tactics as the oppressors. he counseled a different response. Our text says, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I tell you, do not resist an evildoer." Now, the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible actually mistranslates the Greek verb here. Biblical scholars have shown that it should not read simply, "do not resist." It should say, "do not violently resist." Further, it would make no sense for Jesus to say, "do not resist evil." He was constantly calling on people to reject evil and to turn instead to the right and the true and the good. At the beginning of his own ministry, he went into the wilderness for 40 days, where he overcame temptations by resisting evil. Jesus doesn't call on his followers to step aside and let evil win the day. He's calling for a resistance without violence. Jesus immediately provides examples. He says, "If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the left cheek as well." Now, a slap on the right cheek is a backhanded slap. It is meant to humiliate you. It is something someone with greater power does to someone with lesser power. It's what a master does to a slave. It's what a Roman soldier does to a Jew. It was intended to command subservience. It was intended to humiliate. Jesus counsels defiance. He says, "If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the left cheek to them as well." Do not retaliate physically, but take a courageous posture that says, "Your blows do not humiliate me. I am not subservient. You cannot force me to comply. I refuse to cooperate." The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. patterned his nonviolent resistance on this teaching of Jesus. Jesus gives another example. "If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, well, then give them your cloak as well." Now, anyone who would be taken to court and sued for his coat was very poor. It was most likely a peasant farmer who couldn't repay his loan. His creditor is taking his coat, and next he will take his land away from him. Jesus says, if anyone sues you for your coat, that is your outer garment, well, then give them your cloak as well, that is your undergarment. Jesus says, take your clothes off and hand them to the creditor and stand naked in court. New Testament scholar Warren Carter reveals why Jesus would counsel such an action. The gesture represents the stripping away of the land and the property by the creditor. By standing naked before one's creditor, who has both garments in his hands, one shames the creditor and exposes the greed and the unjust system that the creditor represents. This nonviolent action unmasks the powerful one as heartless and inhumane. Jesus has another piece of advice for nonviolent resistance. He says, if anyone forces you to go a mile, go a second mile. Roman soldiers could compel a Jew to carry his pack for a mile. It was another way that they had of reminding Jews that you are subservient to us. Jesus says, go ahead, carry the pack with him for a mile, but don't stop there. Keep going. Again, It's a strategy for refusing to be humiliated. It refuses to play the game on Rome's terms. Instead of feeling superior, the soldier now is caught off guard. What's this guy doing? Further, the Emperor Domitian had put in an edict that said his soldiers couldn't unfairly harm a subject. Would this subject, who's walking the second mile, now put up some kind of complaint against the soldier? See, the carrier of the backpack has now seized the initiative. He's caused the oppressor to become anxious. Jesus was not commanding acquiescence. He was laying the groundwork for a nonviolent revolution. Jesus follows this with a teaching. You've heard it said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. If you love those who love you, what reward will you have for that? Don't the tax collectors do the same thing? Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Most of us generally follow conventional wisdom. We love those who love us. We do not love our enemies. That's why they're our enemies. We hate them. But the kind of love that Jesus calls on us to exude is radical. It loves even those who commit injustice. It resists injustice and evil, but it does not wish evil on the perpetrator. You may remember being taught as a child, hate the sin, but love the sinner. The radical love of Jesus prays not only or not for the demise of the enemy, but prays instead for the transformation of the enemy. It's an extreme love, a love that is much more than most of us can muster. But it stands out there as the goal, and is surely what Jesus is pointing to when he calls us to be perfect. Perhaps this provides a glimpse of the kind of love Jesus challenges us to express. When Nelson Mandela was in prison, he did not hate his jailers. He constantly treated them with dignity, going out of his way to show his jailers respect. He seemed to realize that they were captive of an evil of which they needed to be freed. It was the same with those who supported the apartheid and orchestrated his 27 years of imprisonment. Rather than doing what most of us would do, label them as enemy, seethe with anger, and dream of destroying them, Mandela was able to look beyond their treatment of him and somehow envision their transformation. John Carlin, the author of his biography, wrote, "Mandela succeeded because he chose to see good in people who 99% of us would have judged beyond redemption. Instead of eliminating the enemy and starting from zero, he thought of a way to incorporate the enemy into a new order, deliberately built on the foundations of the old. conceiving of his revolution not primarily as the destruction of apartheid, but instead as the unification and the reconciliation of all South Africa. Mandela broke the mold. Perhaps in these divisive days that we are experiencing, we need to remember that those whose ideas are contrary to ours are children of God, just as we are. And perhaps love, the radical love of Jesus, can help us find a path forward.